Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm John Harney, here in my office, as I have been in recent videos. Pretty happy that I'm getting videos out every couple of weeks. Would love to get them out a bit more often, but coming to the end of a busy semester, and let's see what the summer brings. I had a whole bunch of ideas about what to talk about this week, and as I sometimes do, ideas beget more ideas and other things happen. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about kind of history and games today. And what I mean by that is when Bob started History Respawned all that long time ago and I joined on a little bit after, we always had this vision and this kind of an idea about, how is history represented in games? How do people who play games consume history, like in their spare time and everything? And then, Bob in particular really wanted academics to understand, hey, you are teaching people who are getting their history in this way. The extent to which they're engaging with that very purposefully really varies massively. So like what I mean by that is that, some people would really come out of an Assassin's Creed game and feel like, I really feel like I'm getting at least some kind of a flavour of an historical experience or a Crusader Kings or something like that. And then other players might play, like a Battlefield or World War II theme game, something like that. And obviously they know that it's historical, but they're not thinking of it as something they're consuming in that way. But they are, right? And so when I talk about history and games, I teach a class here at Centre most Januaries called History and Video Games. And I'm always telling people it's history and video games. And it's very different to the history of video games, which is interesting. But I've had some difficulties with it over the years. I've had challenges getting readings I like. For me, at least, the way that I would kind of get into the history of video games becomes kind of like an economic or a business history, which is definitely not a strength for me. Like cultural history is I'm way more comfortable doing things like that, which is why, as I often do, I end up talking about East Asia a lot because I know the context already and I can talk about it and I can talk about the evolution of games in the context of the Japanese post-war economy and things like that. So yeah, that's a lot of what this channel is about, and I guess one of the goals I've been thinking this over the last week or two, thinking I must put a video together for the channel, is, this has been a bit of a shift, and it kind of started as an idea of, I want content to be there, and I just want, if anything, just a way for the algorithm or whatever it is else to just prod some videos in front of people, because there's so much great work on the channel that I'm very proud of and that Bob is proud of. And that I think is really useful, and I hope people keep kind of discovering that. And so as much as our current iteration of the channel is me talking to a camera in my office and maybe other exciting locations, as we did a couple of times ago in Atlanta, it's not that I no longer value the interview kind of footage kind of thing. It's just not something I'm doing now, which is largely for logistical reasons. So what can this channel do? What can these updates be like? What are things that I can do that kind of stay in the same spirit? And I think a lot of the time I'll be playing like games. Here's a game I'm playing. At the moment, that's a little bit challenging because the last video game I bought was Marathon, which I'm really enjoying and I really want to talk about. But I'd love to be in a position where I could say, hey, such a game came out. Let's talk about it. But my budget isn't quite there yet. I hope to have one before too long, actually, to get to a position where I can maybe have a slightly more focused kind of week-to-week experience. So this week, talk about kind of history and games, and kind of really not so much talk about games specifically, but talk about the challenges of talking about games, or maybe what's kind of hanging me up, right? So, for example, Marathon. I'm playing a lot of Marathon. I like Marathon. How would I talk about Marathon from an historian's perspective? And I don't have the answer yet. If I did, this would be a Marathon video. But it is pulling me into these different kind of meta directions. I mean, one of the things that really interests me is thinking of Bungie as a company, and thinking of the original Marathon games, and obviously then Halo, of course, Destiny, and now Marathon. And there's the extent almost to which some people take for granted how successful Bungie have been. I think it hurts them sometimes. I think because Marathon isn't the number one game on the internet, there's just this kind of rolling kind of concern about it, which isn't all Bungie, right? It's all this issue about online shooters disappearing and things like that. But that element of the history of Bungie as a company, it's interesting, I guess, to a point. I don't know. I think, if you're interested in kind of the history of a company, I would 100% recommend Jason Schreier's Play Hard, his book on Blizzard that came out last year, which is excellent and fantastic, and extremely well sourced. But I don't know. I don't know that is a direction I would go for this channel or just in general. If I was talking to friends, if I was on the phone to Bob or somebody else to talk about, like, how do I talk about Marathon historically, what I keep kind of coming back to is the extent to which Marathon is both an example of persistent trends in Bungie's world building and its approach to science fiction, and also how that reflects particularly Western, but not just Western science fiction in kind of the late 20th century, early 21st century, and some of the things that are kind of coming along, like, you know, massive colony ships, the idea of a space marine, right, a super soldier, AI, what does the future kind of government look like and everything else. At the recent PCA conference in Atlanta, I saw a really interesting talk on the Halo series, and that person's main argument was that, you know, if you look at the Halo community, and he was talking about these kind of inflection points where Halo Reach came out, and it was like, oh, this is the worst Halo, and this is terrible, I'm so frustrated. And at that time, I'm trying to remember the kind of the Halo, the pinnacle Halo was Halo 2 maybe or something, although maybe not. Halo 2 was controversial. And then a few years later you come on and Halo Infinity comes out, and the forum boards are full of people saying, oh, I miss Halo Reach, that was the good Halo. And so he's making this kind of wider point about online communities, and Halo is kind of a nice fit for that because it's huge but also kind of specific and kind of niche and kind of in its own way. And what I wanted to ask him, and I just didn't, I had to run, I couldn't stay for the end of the panel. I was curious about the TV show, and if you haven't seen the Halo TV show, it's not bad. I think it gets a lot better as it goes on. We're never going to get a third season, so maybe don't get too attached to it. But the TV show makes a bunch of changes that TV shows are wont to do. Master Chief's helmet comes off relatively early, so we can actually see the actor's face and his expressions and everything else. And this kind of, you know, the UNSC's flirting with fascism is something we're doing, like, from the word go, basically, and trying to figure out. So now we jump to Marathon, and UESC, and all these bots that you're playing, that you're fighting against, rather, the NPCs are kind of the, you know, the robotic agents of some kind of government, a government that seems to have ulterior motives, or very least doesn't want you there. Meanwhile, you're kind of a freelance person or entity that's jumping into these different runners to represent different kinds of corporations. So it gets you thinking about Kim Stanley Robinson and the Mars trilogy. It gets you thinking about the Culture novels by Ian McBain, although everything gets you thinking about the Culture novels of Ian McBain. And so part of me was thinking, I wonder if I would talk about Marathon in this video, or maybe write something about it that really kind of leans into this idea of where does this kind of literary tradition and this games tradition meet. You know, and I'm not there yet. You know, I would like to be there. It kind of feels like more like something I'd write, maybe. Like I'd write it first, and then after I'd blogged it or published it or whatever, I'd come on here and I'd talk about it. I feel like it would need a lot of reading, which is, you know, not a bad thing. But getting there is kind of hard. I really like the idea, though, of talking about historical video games that aren't obviously historical. And I always have been. You know, like one of my favorite videos that History Spawned has done was on Diablo 3 with Dr. Mickey Brock, who we went to grad school with, and she's great. And although you could say, oh, well, yeah, Diablo 3, it's like vaguely medieval and everything else. I mean, yeah, but very vaguely. And having Dr. Brock on to talk about Satan and satanic imagery, which is something she knows lots about, and what that was like in, for example, the 18th and 17th centuries, which is getting us kind of towards this imagined time that Diablo's in. I love that kind of stuff. And I particularly am interested in, you know, doing a History Respawn video on Marathon, for example. Just haven't cracked it yet. Other options that interest me and are kind of adjacent to Marathon a little bit are just how many games are coming out now that are intentional callbacks to series that are now well established. It's a very strange thing of getting older. That sounds such an old man thing to say, that I obviously should have known that time would feel like it was going faster and that I would be used to a certain kind of time period being important. But it's the telescoping of time that always gets me. So like when I think of Taxi Driver, the film by Martin Scorsese, when I was in college, that movie was just over 20 years old, right? Which means that the equivalent for today's traditional age college student is a movie made in 2002, 2003. That's very hard for me to fathom. And in the game space then, like, I remember being in my late teens, early 20s, and the early Mega Man games just felt ancient. and they weren't even 20 years old yet, you know. Like, but they just seemed like such a major jump back into the past of the medium, of your life, everything. I think part of that obviously is kind of graphics, and that the jump in graphics is so much more dramatic than the jump from film to digital, or changes in cultural practices around filmmaking or whatever, right? But, so yeah, sure, that's part of it. But it still feels strange to me to see these game series now that are just, you know, legendary kind of elements of the history of the medium. Like having a student in my office and see my Ghost up on the shelf and go, oh, Destiny, I played that when I was a kid. And I'm like, you know, a bit kind of befuddled by that kind of thing. I thought of this a lot the other day. I was reading a post in PC Gamer about Heroes of Might and Magic Olden Era, which is kind of a Heroes of Might and Magic game, which is in and of itself, so it's kind of like, you know, if you haven't played them, there's an overland map, you're going node to node, and then you break down to this kind of checkerboard or chessboard or just grid, I suppose, and you send your various troops and things over in a tactical kind of a way. This is a genre that has never quite gone away, particularly in the indie scene. It's kind of always been around, and if you like the Fire Emblem games on Nintendo, it never went anywhere, but there is something very classic feeling about it. And to see Might and Magic Golden Era be a game that it intentionally is evoking one of the early Might and Magic games. And it's doing that even with modern kind of creature comforts and graphics and everything else. And people are reviewing it going, you should be aware this game kind of feels old, but it's great. In the same way that today, on the day of recording, one of the big stories on PC Gamer is that the new Gothic remake has kept all its, quote, Eurojank. You know, it still feels like this weird game. And the person writing about the game loves that. Like, they like that kind of sense of character. So on the one hand, there's this, I think, a significant growth in the medium, because I'm old enough to remember, and of course we still talk about games this way, where a game's polish or a game's the technical prowess of the developers is this thing that has to be stellar no matter what. And it's something to beat a game with. And we do still do that, right? Like, that is, I think, sometimes a problem in games, sometimes a very reasonable thing to do. So to see games come out that are intentionally evoking these older phases, and see remakes come out that have kind of intentionally not crafted a whole new interaction system playing with the game, sometimes maybe for the practical purposes of it's a ton of work, that's really fascinating to me. And although Might and Magic isn't an RTS, it feels RTS-y to me, right? Like real-time strategy. It just feels like a 90s genre. And even though I've been playing those kind of games since the 90s, like they've been coming out this whole time, it's something very 90s about them, and maybe that's something I could do a video in and of itself. You know, the RTS is the ultimate kind of 90s kind of testament. And I go back to some of these games now, and I'm trying to have that kind of 90s experience, and sometimes I realize I didn't want a 90s experience, and then sometimes I'm like, oh, this is great. Like playing an RTS single player, which is a very kind of 1990s way to play an RTS. I'm just fascinated. I mean, I understand where video game players my age, I understand how someone my age is interacting with it. I'm fascinated by how, like, a 20-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 12-year-old is interacting with it. Because I remember playing Command & Conquer, Dune 2000, etc. when I was like 11, 12. So, yeah, I don't know. So I get why 45-year-old me is interested in this game I first encountered at age 12. What is it giving to current young players? And maybe these games aren't like the biggest games young players, but I don't know. So it gets us into this kind of meta conversation about like the history of games. And so maybe I'm getting closer to talking about it in a way that actually kind of interests me. The challenge is building a course around it where doing what I just did for the last 2 minutes for 13 weeks can get old. Ask me how I know. And then finally, the RTS thing, are certain genres forever assigned to certain eras? Is a platformer an 80s thing in some kind of a way? I've been playing Ball X-Pit a lot the last few months, which is basically Arkanoid. Is that like a 70s or a pre-arcade era game forever and ever and ever? Ball X-Pit is awesome, by the way, and totally worth your time, I think. Where are we on these things? What is it about the RTS that feels so quote-unquote 90s. And I think of games, I mean, it's quite long in the tooth now. I guess it's about almost 20 years old now, StarCraft 2, which at the time felt like kind of a return to something old. But, you know, these generic kind of cultural ideas. Like, I don't want to bring Duke Nukem back, right? But a lot of those Blizzard characters had this, I don't know if cheesy is even the right word, like they had this kind of demeanor to them that kind of makes sense in a 90s context. And how do we do that in a games environment? And I think people do it all the time. But then, you know, yeah, our shooters of the 2000s, even though they've existed for long before that. What about role-playing games? I mean, role-playing games, I did not expect to see the quote-unquote CRPG, the computer role-playing game, the Western-style three-quarter view tactical game, kind of come back in the way that it has. But then again, the ultimate kind of example of this is Baldur's Gate 3, which takes that idea and D&D mechanics, but then makes what a lot of people call, you know, a modern kind of RPG. So yeah, I mean, you know, history respawned. Talking about the history of games is very difficult, but I'm starting to take heart from the idea that there's something there that can be worked on. I might start floating it into the course that I do teach, where we talk a lot about, you know, we might do Red Dead Redemption 2 and talk about the American West. There's lots of other, that's kind of a classic thing. Grand Theft Auto Vice City in the 80s in the United States, particularly 80s Miami, things like that, or at least the presentation of 80s Miami. And whereas I've struggled in the past, and it's like, let's talk about the console wars, and it's difficult to kind of get to somewhere that I can work with a class on it, other than getting into things like economic factors, which can or cannot be interesting. It kind of really depends. Maybe there's room now at this particular point to ask students, like, what do they call a retro game? Or what's a game they enjoy, they think of as being kind of old or old school or something else. And that's the great fun about this topic, and it's probably why I'm making the videos, honestly, is it kind of keeps that love alive and keeps you questioning and thinking about, you know, the medium as a whole. So yeah, I mean, I hope you found this interesting. I think in future videos, maybe we'll focus on a specific game, or maybe game news or something like that. We'll kind of keep it going, but really appreciate the people watching the video. Please consider giving it a like if you enjoyed it at all, or if you didn't hate it. And subscribe if you have found your way here and weren't already a History Respawn person. And send the link to friends and go, hey, there's a random Irish guy talking about history. It's cool. And leave comments, say hello, whatever you want to do. And thanks for joining us this week.